All right, well, it is 12 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome each of you to our Southeastern Indiana Animal Science Lunch and Learn series. Today speaking, we're going to have Miranda Edge from Harrison County, Cora Carter from Bartholomew County, and myself, Jill Andrew Richards from Ohio County. And advance to the next slide for some.
You're muted, Jill.
Sorry. Yep, I was. Thank you. Today's topic is the pasture mix. So we're going to go through scouting and soil sampling, common plant species, warm versus cool season, which mix is best, concerns you may find, timing and application, and then different forms of grazing. All right, so we're going to start with scouting. The first step in the development of a pasture weed management program is to scout and identify all weed species in a pasture. Scouting of the pastures and areas adjacent to the pasture should be conducted on a regular basis. Pasture managers should get into this habit of scouting for weeds every time they enter the pasture. So you can do this, a couple of times a week, but at least monthly during your growing season. That's a minimum. So hopefully you can do that more often, but at a minimum, do it monthly during your growing season. Special attention should be given to those weeds that might be new in a pasture or those that are potentially toxic. Go ahead and next slide. All right, so after you're done scouting, you're going to start making a plan of how to do some pasture renovation. The very first step you're going to do to making a plan is to take a soil sample. So some of the tools you're going to need is you're going to need a soil probe, a clean plastic bucket, a trowel, sample bags, and a marker. And so you can get most of these items from your local extension office. I know several of the counties around here definitely have those available, and you can borrow those and then use them for up to 48 hours or a week, whatever you need, and then bring those back. Next slide. So when you're sampling a whole field that you're going to manage, you're going to want to map out an area, and each composite sample should consist of 10 to 20 subsamples spread evenly across the field. And you can see here, this is a zigzag sampling pattern that you can use across your field, so you get a good idea and a good representation of the field overall. The sample depth should be about 6 inches or tillage depth. So once you have all that together and you've taken all of your samples, 10 to 20, you're going to combine each one of those in a bucket, and you're going to stir that up so it gets a good overall sample. And then from there, you're going to load what will fit into your sample bag. And you may be doing multiple fields, multiple pastures at a time. So you want to make sure that as you're filling those sample bags, you're marking them accurately with which field it is, so you know when those results come in that which field it comes from. And don't trust your memory like some of us have probably learned along the way. You won't remember when that sample comes back if you just say sample 1, unless you know that each field is already numbered. It might be a good idea to do a map of each field and label them, so that way when it comes back, you know exactly which one it is. So don't always rely on your memory. Things get busy and different things happen. So next slide. So here's a sample of the submittal form. A&L Great Lakes Laboratory here in Indiana. It's located in Fort Wayne. That's one that is used quite often. I don't know if that's the best ones per se, but it's one that a lot of us use. It's pretty inexpensive, less than $10 for a basic sample with recommendations. So when you send that in, you can ask for recommendations to come back on what analysis results are. So it's going to tell you about organic matter, available phosphorus, exchangeable potassium, magnesium, calcium, soil pH, buffer pH, and all sorts of other elements that you're going to want to look at. So with your next slide, please. When you get your soil test results back, you're going to have where you're going to want to start applying your fertilizer. And so your NPK values are probably your most important ones that you're going to look at. You can take your recommendations that they send with you and probably do a pretty good configuration on your own if you're comfortable with it. of what each thing that you're going to have to apply. It usually comes back with the amount per acre, pounds per acre, or tons per acre, depending on which one. Lime usually comes back as ton per acre, and the rest of it comes back as pounds per acre. So you'll be able to use that analysis. If you're not comfortable with doing the calculations on your own, you can always take it to a fertilizing company, a local co-op or something like that, and always go and show them exactly what your soil test results are. So that way they can send that to you, or you can give that to them and they can apply the appropriate amount. Not everybody has the opportunity to have a soil fertilizer company locally for them. Some of them, I know here we have little Ohio County, so you wouldn't think there'd be any place close. So a lot of our people, if they're not a big operation, more of a small backyard, then they will apply on their own through broadcast, and they'll be able to calculate those. Your local extension office, your A&R educators will be able to help calculate those and at least explain some of the different variables that come back on the soil analysis. All right, next slide. And I'm turning it to Cora.
All right, so today we're going to look at just a few common forage plant species. There are a ton of different kinds of plant species. I would say there are almost countless species that you could use. And all of these have benefits and disadvantages in every part of the country. So around here in the Midwest, I've listed several species that are kind of common around here. And then we're going to just take a look at some of the pictures. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, and we're going to make sure that everybody who registered for this course gets a copy of the PDF version of these slides, so you can go back and look at these later. But this is certainly not a comprehensive examination of all forage plant species. It's just to kind of get your appetite up. So next slide, please. So some common grass species are Kentucky bluegrass. It's a short to medium height, long-lived, highly palatable perennial grass. It's usually used in the pasture with some limited hay use. You might also find this in your yard. So this is kind of a lawn grass, but you can also use it in the pasture. Orchard grass is a perennial bunch grass. It's a little bit taller, 2 to 4 feet tall when it's got its seed heads on. It's got high quality and high yields. It's palatable both as a pasture and as a hay product. Next slide. Perennial rye is a short-lived bunch grass. It's got 2 to 4 foot height with seed heads on. It's perennial. There are both foraged types and turf types of perennial ryegrass, and they do have different characteristics. So if you're wanting to use perennial rye in your pastures as a forage or for your hay, then you would want to definitely get the forage type and not the turf type of perennial ryegrass. This is used for both pasture and hay. Reed canary grass is a perennial sod-forming grass. It's 2 to 5 feet tall when it's got seed heads on. It thrives in wet soils and tolerates drought, but there is some older varieties have high alkaloids, and that has a decreased palatability and animal performance. So you want to choose some newer low alkaloid varieties if you're choosing to plant this grass so that you can have improved palatability. Slide. Smooth brome grass is a tall growing cool season, highly palatable perennial grass that you can use for pasture and hay. Tall fescue, also perennial long-lived bunch grass. It has short rhizomes, so it spreads 2 to 4 feet tall in seed head stage. This one is tolerant of soil acidity, low fertility, poor drainage, drought, and overgrazing, so it's pretty tolerant grass. But most older fields with tall fescue have an infection with an endophytic fungus, and that reduces animal performance. It does help the plant survive all these difficult conditions, but it doesn't improve animal performance. Fescue can be useful in pasture and hay, and is also well suited to winter stockpiling. Next slide, please. The last grass we're going to talk about is Timothy. It's 2 to 5 feet in seed head, perennial bunch grass, primarily a hay plant, but sometimes part of a pasture mix. Short stand life and low quality when you cut it late. So the first cutting has the best production for Timothy, and it doesn't regrow as good after the first cutting of the year. The clumping growth does limit your pasture use, and it's sensitive to hot temperatures. Next slide, please. Some common legumes, which are the leafy plants that you might see, are alfalfa, high yield and high quality, perennial, 2 to 3 feet tall. It's good summer production, multiple cuttings of hay a year, but alfalfa does have a potential for bloat and requires well-drained fertile soils and high management for alfalfa. Bird's foot trefoil is a perennial. It's short-lived. It's mostly used in the pasture, not really in hay. It's palatable and non-bloating. It is tolerant of low fertility and low pH. It must reseed to persist, and it's slow to establish. So if you're trying to plant that in, it can take several years. Next slide. Brimson Clover is a winter annual. It's 1 to 3 feet tall. You may see this used in erosion control or as a soil improvement. It can be used in hay and grazed, but it's really unpalatable and low quality when it's fully mature. So this is more of it's a cover crop for your soil improvement. Sweet clover is a cool season biennial. It's 4 to 8 feet tall. This is primarily a cover crop for wildlife. It does fix nitrogen and is winter hardy, but it does have coumarin, which reduces palatability and can cause hemorrhaging in livestock. So you need to be careful with that as well. Next slide, please. Your white clover is long-lived perennial. It spreads by stolons. I know you're probably familiar with this one. It's 8 to 12 inches tall. Use it in the pasture. It does have a long stand life, but in the summer, it doesn't do very well because it gets really hot and it prefers the cooler seasons. Same with the red clover. It's a cool season perennial. The stands are short-lived for red clover. It does get 2 to 3 feet tall. Red clover is often used in hay and pasture and haylage, widely adapted, easily established, has high yields, but does become a little bit dusty as hay, and over maturity harvesting of red clover can cause some slobber issues. Next slide, please. Some species tolerate a lower pH than others, so that's why it's so important to get a soil test done before you select your species of forage. This slide just kind of breaks down a few of those common different types of forages into their different pH brackets. So that's just something to keep in mind as you are selecting your species. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about warm season versus cool season, and I'm going to talk about primarily grasses in this section, but there are some legumes that are more well suited to cool season and warm season, but I'm going to be talking about grasses in this section. Cool season and warm season grasses use different leaf anatomies and enzymes to carry out photosynthesis. So the ones that we call warm season are more of a tropical grass. They're technically called a C4 grass. That has to do with their molecular structure. The rumen degradation is often faster, the warm season grasses, because of their thinner cell walls. And so warm season grasses are often a higher forage quality. They're more efficient at gathering CO2 and utilizing nitrogen from the atmosphere. They use less water to make dry matter. And their primarily optimum temperatures are in the 90s. They prefer it really hot. Generally, they have lower protein than the C3s, but protein is used more efficiently. Your cool season grasses are temperate. They're technically called a C3. They're more efficient in cooler environments. Their optimum temperatures are 65 to 75 degrees. They're less efficient at higher temperatures, but they do have higher crude protein than C4s. They respond best to nitrogen fertilizers in the cool temperatures of early spring. So your warm season C4s are most productive during the warm summer months, and they need ample moisture to respond well to applied nitrogen. So without irrigation, supplemental nitrogen is seldom useful for only those C4 grasses. C4s can be annual or perennial. Annual C4s include corn, Sudan grass, pearl millet. Perennials include big blue stem Indian grass, Bermuda grass, switchgrass, and your old world blue stems. C3 grasses, which are your cool seasons, can be annual or perennial. Annuals include wheat, rye, or oats. Perennials include orchard grass, fescues, and your perennial ryes. Warm seasons often reach their peak about a month after the cool season grasses and have lower yields overall, but provide superior midsummer grazing. So those cool season grasses are going to be a little dormant when it's too hot for them to grow. Both types can be stockpiled in the late summer and fall and provide some maintenance energy in the wintertime. So, just next slide, please. Here's just a little calendar that can show you how seasonality works in forage species. No species most productive all year long, so some other feed is going to be necessary. If you can note the different growth patterns of your warm season and your cool season grasses, you can see that the top row, the cool season grass will peak somewhere in the June area, and as July and August progress, it's going to decrease productivity. So the warm season grass, the third one down, has a higher productivity during that slump that the cool season grasses have. All right, next slide, please. And now I'll hand it over to Miranda.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked about different species. Now we're going to talk about those mixtures of the pasture species and how they may be dependent on certain livestock species that you are grazing. So if we talk about beef and dairy cattle, they are meant to graze, to eat, to gain muscle mass for meat production. Cows producing calves and or need those same nutrients to develop the calf into a healthy animal that can gain weight efficiently. And then dairy cattle need to be able to produce milk daily. They've all got different nutrient requirements. And so they're going to maybe need a little different mixture, but overall, the value of that grass will assist in helping reduce the amount of concentrates and hay that you need to provide in supplement to maintain and meet the needs of those requirements for nutrition. Cool season grasses, of course, like we said, are an easy addition to any pasture. They've got a longer growing period. They do have that peak time. So if that's something you start with, that's a good starting point. If you look up like a beef cattle seed mix or a dairy cattle seed mix, a lot of times you'll see it start with grasses like bluegrass, orchard grass, fescues, the endophyte-free, of course, for anything that is in production for reproduction, excuse me. And then they'll also have some sort of a legume in a smaller percentage. If you're strictly grazing this pasture or field area, this mixture works really well at about 25% of that bluegrass, 40% fescues, 20% or a little more orchard grass, and then your remaining amount, about 15%, up to about 20% in the legumes like clover and alfalfa. If you're wanting to also cut this for hay, you may look at adding specific legumes or maybe even a little bit more of those legumes than you would if it was just a pasture for grazing. And we look at those legumes like clovers and alfalfas, popular additions to our hay products. Alfalfa is pretty common for legumes for hay, but many producers do hesitate to put it in a grazing pasture due to the possibility of bloat. Now, all legumes could cause this issue, so even adding clover, the trefoil, vetches, or any of the other legumes could be just as detrimental if the cow is not prepared to go onto this field for grazing. The key to reducing that bloat opportunity is to not introduce new pastures to cows that have empty rumens. When the cows are let out, maybe the first thing in the morning from a dry lot, they'll be super hungry. They're going to be more interested in that fresh green grass than eating that hay. So they may have been standing at the gate for a little while and lowering the amount of forage in that rumen. They'll go in, they'll overindulge, they'll start gulping air with the forage, and that's what causes that bloat. So if you're rotating cows onto this new pasture, maybe wait until the later in the afternoon so that their bellies are full with already grazed grasses. Make sure that they're filling up with hay before they go out so that they're not as likely to go out and just gorge and really fill themselves and start collecting a little extra air as they're trying to intake enough grasses for their needs. We also see some other issues with our alfalfa as having to reseed a little bit more often than some of the other legumes. And sometimes it won't take well over being overgrazed and continuous trampling through grazing. So you might find better options through a mixture of clovers and trefoils. Your vetches can become a little invasive and hard to manage, but in a good rotation of grazing, you can manage these very well, and it can keep themselves reproduced and in available grazing levels so that you have a healthy product and a healthy pasture that meets your requirements. I encourage everyone to look up our cover crop field guides as well as our forage field guides. I don't have a recent copy of that, but these are wonderful to have in your truck, in your barn, in your tractor. As you're going out and looking at your pastures, it gives you options for different types of plants, seeding rates, how they work well at different times of the year, and maybe even some combinations of what works well together. So I've kind of used that a little bit as I went through this presentation to give you some more ideas. So when you're adding those legumes to any pasture, it's a great way to add that protein content. They're nitrogen fixers, so that's less nitrogen you really need to add to the pastures, so your fertilizer applications can be reduced. And you're going to just be a little bit more apt to have that energy available for the animal to increase their requirement or increase their intake and meet their requirements. And then if you want to think outside the box, kind of like we talked about spreading out that grazing days and looking into summer annuals, you might be able to look at adding a summer annual in May or June to extend that season and add those proteins that are a little bit more efficient and some higher energy. These are good for if you're trying to finish out some calves going to the stockyards, if you're through your mid-gestation of your cows and you're just pushing them till the point where you're going to put them out on a dry lot or a lower energy hay in the winter so that they can maintain that weight and not get overweight and cause issues with their gestation or parturition. And you might see that plants would include, like we said, the millets, sorghum Sudan, Sudex, and teff is another option in there. The plants that people worry about for this type of summer annual for our possible toxicity through prussic acid is through the sorghum family, most specifically. And that includes of course, sorghum Sudan grass, and even Johnson grass. So as long as these plants aren't, I hit too many buttons. So as long as these plants are not allowed to be overproductive in that, in your pasture mixture, and you're able to get them grown up to around 2 foot in height before you do graze those with your livestock, you'll reduce the amount of toxicity. That prussic acid is higher in those younger plants, those new plants, and can be concentrated by the stress factors like drought or frost conditions. So if you get into that point in the fall, then you would want to manage and have the ability to move them to a different pasture or to feed them hay and keep them off of that until the plant is able to come out of that stress and grow to about 2 foot. And like I said, this is usually a fall condition, not so much a spring stress factor. And so unless you're using a lot of Johnson grass in your pastures, you may be looking at that as it starts to emerge. But Johnson grass is going to be one of those later emerging, and you should have enough of your other grasses, your cool season grasses, growing in advance of those to help maintain that mixture percentage and reduce the amount of toxicity that you'll see through prussic acid. Teff is, again, another option for our summer annuals, as it does have a fairly high yield. It's drought tolerant and can bring in a little extra energy to your stock without an excess of amount of soluble carbohydrates. And that'll be important a little bit more in horses than maybe in beef or dairy cattle. But that's another option that you can give yourself for grazing or to make hay. Going further into the year, then we look at an even more extension of our grazing days. Those cover crops are another way to add those days of grazing and reducing the amount of hay that you need to be feeding in the winter. The cost is reduced in your overall management, and workload could be reduced by adding a little bit of an extra time in the tractor seeding out these cover crops after the full flow of your summer annuals. Options for easy planting and fast growing fall cover crops, like we found here in our cover crop field guide, include triticale, ryegrass, winter wheat, and field or winter peas. These are quick, fast growing. They take less days to emerge, and they're going to give you an extra grazing days in the fall for short windows, and then can lie dormant and regrow and offer more days in the spring to graze prior to moving to a cool season pasture. You can also look at spring cover crops. So if you're not able to get those fall cover crops in, like I personally was not able to get fall crops in, cover crops in this year, so I'm going to be looking more at a spring cover crop option, and I'm going to look into something like annual rye, spring or winter oats, clovers or buckwheats, and look at those as options for adding to my pastures that maybe are needing a little bit of a boost, maybe needing some reseeding as we get closer to those cool season grass high points of yields. And so this is going to give my soil more coverage and improve those overall healths, while also giving my livestock a chance to start grazing earlier in the year. Okay. So if we move to small ruminants, they're pretty similar to the requirements of beef cattle. Of course, their daily intake is much smaller, so you can add more units per acre, and that can make a difference in the amount of pasture proteins and the amount of mix percentages that you're looking at. Rotating your pastures may be at a different pace, as they will eat differently than cattle. Your sheep will graze a little bit closer, and the goats like to browse seed heads and taller plants before they go into that lower growing forages. You can use the same pastures for both types of ruminants, as I have seen a few instances where beef cattle will graze ahead of small ruminants in a rotation to gain the most benefit from all plant species in the pasture. Same issues can occur with bloat and prussic acid poisoning in our small ruminants, just as in our large ruminants in beef cattle and dairy cattle. So using the same precautions, filling their bellies, filling the rumens with a dried hay or other grasses prior to moving them into a legume pasture is necessary to reduce that bloat and the prussic acid poisoning again in the fall, just making sure that those summer annuals are at least 2 feet in height, and that's specifically for the sorghum family. Other problems that we might see in these ruminants, just as in beef cattle, would be grass tetany. This occurs in the springtime mostly when grasses are growing quickly and the moisture in the plant is increased, which reduces the concentration of magnesium in the plant. And so this reduces the magnesium they're taking in, and that does not meet the requirements of those animals, especially the ones that are lactating. To combat this is pretty simple. offering more magnesium is the key to reducing grass tetany. You'll see a lot of times companies will put out a loose mineral that's called high mag or added magnesium. These are very important to include, especially in the spring for those lactating animals. My finger is trigger happy today, I apologize. Those lactating animals definitely need a little more magnesium, especially in the spring, but all those animals can also benefit from that added magnesium, and it should not hurt any of these livestock for that extra opportunity to add magnesium to their diet. Another option for those grass tetany options or problems is to keep your lactating animals off of that type of a pasture that's maybe quickly growing and high moisture, and only allow the younger animals or dry cows to graze after filling their rumens with the hay or other maybe cover crops that have matured a little bit earlier. Similar symptoms can also be seen or caused by nitrate poisoning, and we mostly see this issue when livestock are allowed to graze like corn stalks, oat straw, or even weedy pastures with an empty rumen. And that empty rumen, again, is our problem, our important issue to cover for the health of your livestock. So keeping that rumen full at all times not only helps your feed efficiencies, your gain of your animal, but it also helps in reducing those toxicities and problems with nutrient requirements that we see, and sometimes, especially in the springtime. Looking at ensiling these types of forages, the corn stalks, the oat straw, things that might possibly have that higher nitrates, can actually help to reduce it. During the fermentation process, those gases that are released will include some of the nitrates in gaseous form, and it will then be, of course, removed from that product. So if you have a concern with that, we certainly are able to send tests to the labs for nitrate contents, and then look again in about 3 to 4 weeks after ensiling to see if there's a reduction in nitrates to a point where it would not cause toxicity in your animals. So we move to horses. Horses may seem a little bit more finicky to some people, but it all really depends on your requirements for the horse and its breed history. So for instance, I'm talking a little bit about specific breeds having maybe metabolic diseases in their particular breed history. And these tend to be those compact muscular horses like quarter horses and Morgans, draft horses, and draft horses can sometimes have some of these metabolic diseases just depending on what their breeding history is, maybe some mixing of different breeds earlier in their history that would cause some of these. These types of horses do not do well on a pasture that would have alfalfa or a high concentrate of any other legume. In fact, most people with these types of horses will attempt to reduce the amount of legumes in that pasture and keep only those cool season grasses and possibly a summer annual in there for them to graze. So that helps to maintain their insulin levels and reduce the diabetic-like symptoms that you can see out of these horses. It's pretty safe to start with those cooler season lineups. And you have to look at what that animal is actually doing. If you go to the race industry, they're going to have a totally different story, but they're going to be asking those horses to be using a lot of their energy daily. Definitely very different from a horse that's just grazing in the pasture, maybe does some trail riding, leisure riding, pleasure horses. They're going to have the least requirements for proteins and carbohydrates and could have some more issues with those soluble carbohydrates than, let's say, a racehorse, one that does endurance riding, cross country, stadium jumping, or even pulling heavy loads. So you just have to look and work with maybe a nutritionist or extension educator to determine the specific needs of your horse and look at what would be your best options as far as pasture mixes to make the right choice and requirements for your animal. I would caution looking at using some of those summer annuals other than teff. I mentioned that before. This is a product or a plant product that has a smaller amount of those soluble carbohydrates and is definitely a great option for grazing as far as or as cut for hay, depending on what your needs are and what your ability is on your particular property. Cover crops tend not to be a favorite among horse owners, but there's maybe nothing wrong with adding a grass option to extend your grazing season or even increase the amount of hay that you're able to cut and bale each year. I personally, on the farm that I use for my horses, we will use winter wheat hay for a cover crop in our grain fields, and then cut that each spring for a dried hay product. This has around 10 to 13% crude protein when it's a dried hay product and is a little bit lower in those soluble carbohydrates. It works really well for our mixture of quarter horses, Morgans, and draft mixes, draft crosses that we are feeding year round. Okay, and the last group that I'm looking at today are camelids. Of course, you can also do pasture grazing for swine, so they would have maybe some different requirements. And if that's something you're interested in, let us know, and we can get you some more information about them. But we're seeing a lot more of these llamas and alpacas as part of maybe a mixture of livestock, using them as livestock guardians or even as pets and show animals in smaller properties. So they are very similar to ruminants as they have those multiple stomachs. They do have a little bit higher nutrient requirements than some of the other ruminants we've talked about today. So we need to look at the concentration of legumes versus protein, or for the protein content that would be necessary to meet their requirements. And this really goes more for those lactating animals and those animals that are trying to gain weight and become a mature weight animal. The ones that are used for fiber production and maybe even your males used in breeding may not have as much of a nutrient requirement as those other ones. They tend to like to eat closer to the ground, so bunch grasses will be more effective for their grazing style. And so adding more of those bunch type grasses would be effective for making a more healthy pasture that's able to maintain their style of grazing. Because they're ruminants, they can also be subject to the similar toxicity issues that we talked about with our cattle and small ruminants. So again, keeping that rumen full is very, very important to the health of your livestock of any sorts, and watching and maintaining your grasses and your grass species for growth, maturity, and the level of possible toxicities that you'll see in the summers and the fall. If you have more questions about that, just let us know. But for now, we're going to move on to our tilling practices. And I believe Jill's coming back on.
That's me. I had to unmute. Thanks, Miranda. All right, so we've done a lot of discussing about the different plant varieties, soil testing, scouting, all types of information that I'm sure you guys are getting a little overwhelmed. And that's why we're going to send you these slides when we're all done here so you can review. But just wanted to touch base a little bit and mention about different ways to get those plant species into the ground. One that's fairly common, especially in our area with a lot of the sloping ground and the highly erosive soils, is no-till. And I know there are a lot of counties where you can have access to a no-till drill through your soil and water. So if you're thinking about using no-till as a way to get your seeds in the ground, maybe reach out if you don't have a drill yourself and see if your local soil and water conservation district has those to lease or rent or however they do that. Sometimes there's a cost and sometimes there's not, but that's definitely better than having to go out and buy one on your own. So check that out. No-till is definitely good when you have a lot of soil that you're wanting to preserve. If you've already got seed or sod that's already there, or some grasses or legumes that are already established, but maybe they've been grazed really low. That way you can get those seeds in contact with the soil. It helps to make sure that you reduce erosion, and it's a greater renovation for your forage yields and often less weed encroachment. So no-till is definitely one way to do it. You can also do tillage if that's something that you're able to do. If you want to completely start over and start fresh, and you could do a burn down, which really isn't the greatest in your pastures to do, but because you don't want to have to reestablish from scratch. But if you're doing your hay fields or something like that and you want to completely start over, you can do a burn down and still do no-till, or you can use tillage as well. So we won't go into a great depth of what tillage is. It's pretty self-explanatory. Next slide. Something else that you could do, and this is a perfect time to do it, is frost seeding. And that's done through broadcast seeding. It's something that you can do in your pastures, you can do in your hay fields. It's a great way to incorporate some legumes. Red clover is probably your most common that you use in frost seeding. And the biggest thing to remember is making sure that seed comes in contact with the soil. So whether it's been grazed really low, or like I said, maybe you've done some weed control and burned down some of your weeds or things like that, putting your frost seeding on with your red clover is something that's going to get a lot of nutrients back into your soil, but it's also going to improve the quality of the forages. If you can go to the next slide, some of the other considerations with frost seeding, red clover, it's something that you can do every year, but the red clover will last up to 3 years generally if the soil fertility is right. So you do want to check that out. If you've never frost seeded before and this is the first time, you're going to want to go at a higher rate. You know, instead of the 5 to 7 or around 6 pounds per acre, you're going to want to go 8 to 12 pounds per acre to do the application. Make sure that you're applying it evenly. You want to make sure that you're not overlapping a lot, and definitely take the time to double check to make sure that it is going to come in contact with the soil. If you put the seeds down and it's just going to sit in with a bunch of grass, then it's not going to be worth your money to put into that. But frost seeding is something that you can do right now. You know, maybe, I don't know how much snow everybody has, but sometimes if you have a light snow down, it's good to go ahead and do that frost seeding, so then you can watch your tracks when you're passing by, and you know that you're not overlapping it or you're not maybe missing a lot of it. So frost seeding works really well. If you're sitting where we are, like here in the county where I work, I wouldn't do it right now just because we're sitting at about 12 inches of snow. So it's a little much, but if you've got a slight covering to help keep track of where you've been, it's a lot easier. You would think that you wouldn't get lost in a big pasture or field, but after you make several passes back and forth, you might miss some. So it's great to have a little bit of coverage on there, and it'll help keep the seeds in place. So that's something that you can do. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit now about grazing management. So I'm going to turn it over to Cora.
Okay, yeah, we're going to just take a few moments to just briefly get into grazing management. Of course, it's something that we can talk a lot about. We could do a whole session on grazing and rotational grazing, but we're just going to take a few slides to briefly talk about it. In the springtime, when you're returning your animals to the pastures after the pastures have recovered from winter, the good rule of thumb is to wait for at least 5 to 6 inches of growth before grazing. I know Miranda said earlier that there are some differences depending on your species. So it really does depend on the species that you have in your pastures, but 5 to 6 inches of growth is a good rule of thumb for your first graze. And remember that large amounts of any new feed can upset your animal's guts. So just like she was saying, start with short times of grazing, or make sure you fill them up with something else before they go out into the pasture so that you don't have problems with the bloat. Next slide, please. Once you're into rotation, if you're interested in rotational grazing and your animals are used to the pasture, start grazing a new pasture when it reaches 8 to 10 inches during the growing season, and move your animals when the grass gets down to 4 or 5 inches. You don't want to let it get down to 3 inches or lower, because that is it's really difficult for your plants to recover, and you're going to lose a little bit of productivity from your pasture grasses. If it takes longer than a week for your animals to get it down from 8 to 10 inches to 4 to 5 inches, then you should decrease the size of your pasture or add more animals to just move through your pastures efficiently. You also want to consider regular mowing, especially if the animals are not knocking it down uniformly. Those stemmy seed heads are not palatable and they have low nutritive value, but you don't want to mow below 4 inches. If you control the height of your grass or legumes, size of the grazing area, and percentage of pasture allowance, you can allocate feed specifically to your animals. So keeping your plants in the pasture in a vegetative state by always making sure that you don't graze them too short and put them in a dormant state, and then moving your animals to a new pasture as soon as your minimum height is reached. Those are important strategies for rotational grazing. Next slide, please. You should also keep a stress lot or a dry lot or a barn lot that you keep your animals in, particularly on rainy or muddy days when the traffic of your animals can really damage the sod of your pasture. If you have a lot of summer annuals, you should mow in the fall when the seed heads form. If you want to drop those seeds to reseed your pasture. If you don't want to reseed, then you should mow before the seed heads form or before they mature. Next slide, please. Rotational grazing is a large pasture divided into several paddocks. So livestock are moved from one to the next, and it allows your forages to rest between grazing periods. These plants are healthier because they're remaining in the growing stages all summer, and it increases your forage productivity. It also helps distribute manure better as a fertilizer and reduces forage waste. If you've ever done conventional grazing and you have this huge pasture and you turn your animals out on it and they always stay in one spot and never go down in the far reaches of your pasture, you're just not using that properly. So you can force your animals to graze those sections that they don't want to spend time in by using rotational grazing. This also extends your grazing season and allows you to stockpile forage for the wintertime. And you can change the timing and intensity, size of your pasture based upon your needs. So if you need bigger pastures because you don't want to move them as frequently, you don't want to put as much intensive time management into it, you can certainly change that based upon your needs and your desires. And that's what makes rotational grazing great and what makes it work well for you. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to show you some example of how healthy your forages are when they're on a short rotation. So if you're keeping your grazing period short and you're really moving your animals through every week, these plants on the left are the most healthy plants. You allow them a nice long recovery. If you have quite a lot of pastures that you're moving through, then those plants will recover really well. If you're on continuous graze and you don't do any rotating, then those plants are not able to recover well and their roots are not penetrating well into the soil. So that's just a graphical representation of what rotational grazing can do for the plants in your pasture. And I believe that that's the last slide that we have. So if anybody has any questions, you can come off mute or you can pop it in the chat box and we can talk about it. We have about 12 minutes left in our hour. So